think about PEP risk management, we think about really 5 areas that we need to be thinking about. We need to identify who is a PEP, which means we have to understand what a PEP is. We have to establish an initial risk rating associated with that PEP. And we need to think about the factors that go into the risk rating and how those factors are weighted. There needs to be due diligence performed as a result of that initial risk rating, which will lead to an updated risk rating. And the question around that due diligence is what level of due diligence is appropriate? What triggers will result in an updated and likely increased risk rating? And then, of course, we have ongoing monitoring. What type of monitoring should take place? How should it be done? And when to loop back into the updated risk rating. So these are challenges that organizations face with respect to PEP risk management. When we think about the PEP risk rating and what we just talked about in terms of an initial risk rating, we need to think about it in terms of the factors that will be likely be included. And this is not meant to necessarily be an exhaustive list of factors, but a representative list. And so we're thinking about the type of PEP, who it is, how long they've either been a PEP or how long they've not been a PEP, what geography they're from, what are the funds flow that's involved, what's the regulatory regime in the area where they're from. And each of those factors would be assigned a weight. We've chosen to have a weighting scale of high, medium, and low here. It could be a scale of 1 to 10. Whatever it is, there would be a weighting assigned to the factors. And then based upon the outcome of that and the risk rating that results from that, there'd be a due diligence effort. And that due diligence effort would look at things like source of funds, source of wealth, reputation as evidenced through adverse media, perhaps. And then similarly, having the weights associated with those, high, medium, and low. And that would result in your PEP risk rating. And then obviously over the course of time, there needs to be ongoing monitoring and updating of that risk rating and of that due diligence to make sure that the risk rating reflects that risk that's really and truly faced by the organization. Moving on then, I wanted to provide an example of the regulatory focus and penalties that can transpire as a result of poor PEP risk management. So in our example here, we've talked about the customer, the onboarding process, the risk rating, due diligence, both event-driven and periodic due diligence, and ongoing monitoring as really the components of effective risk management. And in the case of Gatehouse Bank and the penalties that they faced, there were really 5 key points brought out by the Financial Conduct Authority that issued a penalty in October of 2022. And these 5 key points that are considered in this enforcement action are failure to identify PEPs, failure to have effective event triggers to initiate due diligence, failure to have effective periodic due diligence, failure to have risk ratings reflect the existence of PEPs, and failure to have effective ongoing monitoring. So all of the necessary components had a failure of one form or another. And this resulted in a penalty assessment. And the original penalty would have been on the order of £2,263,000. But there were a series of mitigating factors and remedial actions that were taken by the bank. And the final penalty that was assessed was £1,584,000. So this amount of the penalty was pretty substantial given the size of the organization. So I think that needs to be taken into account when looking at those absolute numbers. But it's reflective of the fact that without these PEP risk management activities, there can be a direct link to penalty assessments.
So looking at a practical, more risk-based approach to addressing PEP challenges, of course, we're going to start off with looking at the risk rating. Where can we get some of those additional factors that Steve's been discussing? It's not just who the person is, it's what they do, it's where they live, it's what products they have, and so on. And taking a look at countries and territories first, we frequently say here that a PEP is a PEP because we know what they do. And if we know what they do in terms of a political position, we must know where they do it. So PEPs, unlike some other information regarding terrorist organizations and individuals and so on, country information is much more of a fixed point. And so being able to accurately look at a country and having some idea of purely that territory, does that elevate or does that reduce the risk? And there's a number of different data sources that you might want to consider. So for instance, Transparency International. Transparency International for a number of years now has annually published their Corruption Perceptions Index, a database of pretty much all global countries and territories, looking at a number of factors such as their FATF mutual evaluation scores, their law enforcement framework, and so on. And and how that then creates a sort of a weighting system according to potential for corruption within that country. So that's a great source of information. Equally, of course, as a number of these other sources that I'll be talking about, and including the Transparency International CPI, there is the underlying FATF data itself. And that's really in two parts: the grey blacklists, formerly known as the sort of non-compliant countries and territories, and indeed the more detailed country mutual evaluation scores. Both of those could be used to highlight very specifically when looking at grey-black, high and very high risk countries, or if you want to get a more universal look across all countries, the mutual evaluation scores. Similarly, the Basel Committee published their AML index, very similar, with some divergence in methodology and underlying sources to the Transparency International Corruptions Index. There's also a great website, knowyourcountry.com, which is run as a free resource by a company based out of Jersey. That's Jersey in the Channel Islands, not New Jersey in the US. But of course, you also have any legal notices, guidance, and updates from your own regulatory and law enforcement and government agencies. And two fairly recent examples of that are here in the UK. His Majesty's Treasury published a notice on high-risk third countries, I believe originally back in 2017, but was subject to an update in June of this year. And in the US, the Department of State's International Narcotics Control Strategy highlighted a number of countries that are subject to much more risk of money laundering due to associated crimes in narcotics. So when you're looking at, how do we score a country, and how does that then feed into an overall risk rating of our PEPs? That's just some of the underlying sources that you might want to consider using.
So, Kieran, we have a question that's come up, and it's asking, what about high net worth individuals and Hollywood status individuals in addition to politically exposed persons? For example, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and so forth. And I think this, go ahead.
I was going to say, I love the fact they've also given the example of Taylor Swift in that question.
And I think it goes back to what I said a little bit earlier. If it walks like a PEP and it talks like a PEP, it probably is. So, I think that, with somebody like, let's take, for example, Bill Gates, who does a lot of things around the world through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and has a lot of contact with folks that might be considered PEPs. I think, he could conceivably, under certain circumstances, I suppose, be, a close associate with a PEP. So I think it's going to be something that needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I don't think that he wouldn't. He's not a politician in the sense of an elected official, but is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation one that is sort of a quasi governmental agency because it's distributing monies around the world? Those are questions that are probably going to have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to level of influence over politicians and policies. Someone like Taylor Swift, probably not so much. Someone like Leonardo DiCaprio, who's been, or indeed Bill Gates, who have been very vocal and have pushed for changes in things like environmental policy. That would need to be something you need to kind of almost manually assess. It's not in that strict prescription of politically exposed. They're not elected into a position of political of public service, but they're taking it upon themselves to hopefully help influence those who are. So yeah, very much to your point, Steve. Do they fall into that close associate category, business associate, a close friend, things like that? That again, it comes down to that divergence of definition from country to country, region to region.
And that leads. There's another question here about commercially exposed persons. Some people have power without being elected or appointed. For example, David Beckham. I think it's a similar sort of thing to the extent that they stand out in their statements, and to the extent that they have a close relationship with political officials, they could conceivably be determined as a close associate. Again, it's going to be facts and circumstances related.
Absolutely.
And just to cover this last question that's here about EU and OFAC sanctions lists, would be helpful in screening PEPs. I think that's a bit of a one-way street. So in other words, if someone is on a sanctions list, they could probably be a PEP as well, but somebody who's on a PEP list is not necessarily on a sanctions list. So that's what I mean by one-way street there. But if
Yeah.
they're on a sanctions list, you probably wouldn't be considering them beyond the fact that they're on that sanctions list, and you probably shouldn't be doing business with them. So
Not much need there to do enhanced due diligence. Someone's already
right,
done that for you,
right,
essentially. And I think that's the way I always look at the difference between PEP screening and sanction screening. Sanction screening is after the fact. They've been identified. It's a known risk, so much so that regulators and governments have prescribed that this is now an absolute. Whereas your PEP screening, where they're not a sanction, is to look at the potential for risk now and future risk. Sanctions have that ship has already sailed, and someone's pretty much done that for you. But to that point about David Beckham, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Taylor Swift, maybe not so much. It really comes down to things such as the roles as well. If Taylor Swift was friends with somebody who is the town mayor, not so much risk there. If Warren Buffett is friends with a head of state in Central Africa, maybe more risk. And so looking at the actual underlying roles of the PEPs and being able to make certain risk-based decisions and feed that into a risk model is really important, because not all PEPs are made equal in their risk. And generally, when you look across a lot of the sort of globally consolidated PEP databases, you'll see role types defined similar to what you see here. And you can look at them at sort of different levels. You've got your internationals and others. You've got your national level and your regional level. And at the international level, you've got things like religious leaders, international officials, people like the head of FIFA or the World Bank and things like that. And perhaps potentially more questionably here, embassy and consular staff. Because I know me and you, Steve, spoke about a recent enforcement action where was it the trade mission to the UN from North Korea? If I'm
yes, yeah,
remembering that correctly.
right. So that was in the context of using PEP lists for doing sanction screening. And in that particular situation, the folks that were at the UN mission from North Korea were not prohibited from opening up accounts because they weren't on a PEP list. Well, the sanctions regulations talks to nobody from North Korea can open up an account. So that was an incorrect use of the PEP list for purposes of sanction screening, which gets back to the point I made a little bit earlier. But it's in this situation, is the consular staff, if they're a secretary, meaning an administrative assistant, or part of the janitorial staff, are they a PEP? Probably not. But obviously the ambassador and maybe direct support staff to the ambassador would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you've got national government ministers, heads and deputy heads of state corporations, political party officials, and so on. And then at the regional level, you've got things like city mayors, regional government ministers, local officials, and so on. But also bearing in mind that when you start looking at the fact that there is divergent definitions, there are countries like Spain that have the sort of what's commonly referred to as additional domestic screening requirements for PEPs, where they've expanded the definitions. It goes much further down the chain, down to a much smaller level. So maybe something like that, the mayor of a small sort of provincial town. And if you're not directly doing business in Spain, do you need to be screening those? And that needs to be a question too. But ultimately, what you need to be doing here is looking at that roles and figuring out what's the risk associated at each level. What's the risk associated with each individual role, and how can that feed into a risk rating? Now, of course, the good news here is once you start being applying a risk-based approach, identifying what you truly need to be looking out for, you start to see a very noticeable difference straight away. So if we're to plot here on the number of list profiles that potentially you will be screening your customers against versus how you can then filter that down by certain risk factors, you'll see that the numbers go down pretty quickly. So if you're going to be taking that screening all PEPs, all RCAs globally, 72% of you on our poll question there, you're screening your customers against upwards of 2 million plus profiles. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of people that you can match to. As soon as you start thinking about name commonality, maybe we don't have a lot of identifiable information like date of birth, you are absolutely going to be getting false positives. We filter that down to PEPs only in higher risk roles that we're actually concerned with, that we think would necessitate any form of enhanced due diligence. That might go down to about 1 million. What if we then start aligning that with the particular regulations, like Canada, for instance, that we looked at earlier, 5 years in 5 years out of office? Well, that now goes down to 220,000. We're getting rid of screening against PEPs that haven't held a position in 20 years, and we're focusing on what the regulations actually say, in that particular region at least, we absolutely should be doing. Of course, if we were to model that based on the UK guidance for domestic PEPs, 220,000 would be a lot less than that. And then what if you limit it only to certain territories that you absolutely do business in? You don't need to worry about identifying, a foreign PEP that would have no ability to open from your country, because you don't, if you're going to screen, let's say, Iranian PEPs, but your website, your platform checks IP addresses, and you just don't allow an account opening for any IP address trackable to Iran at all. So maybe do that. That now goes down to 211,000. So you can start applying that risk-based approach and really reduce down the sort of broad footprint of your potential screening processes. And of course, the same is true in the relationships for RCAs, those relatives and close associates we've been speaking about. Again, you've got different relationship roles and different levels. Advisors and business associates, somebody's legal counsel, somebody's realtor or estate agent, somebody's accountant. Yeah, that's pretty important. That's potentially high risk if they are related to somebody who is high risk. Somebody's cousin, aunt, uncle, grandparents, grandchildren. As Steve, you said earlier on, quite funnily, somebody's second cousin twice removed, but only on a Tuesday. The point being, again, not all relationships are to be considered with the same level of risk, because ultimately this is all about prioritization. And the old adage goes, if everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority, and you're screening everyone the same. So again, the question needs to be asked: how are you going to risk rate those in fact, as a factor in your overall risk assessment? And the same thing is true, you'll be glad to hear, in relatives and close associates, as it is with the PEPs by their roles themselves. The number of profiles versus filtering by certain risk factors, you can go down from 790,000, but if we restrict that down to immediate family members or only key business associates, down to 720,000. If we reduce that down further, only to lower risk jurisdictions that we absolutely do business in, we can be more selective because they are lower risk jurisdictions. We've got established businesses there and procedures. Great, goes down to 712,000. But maybe you still want to cover high risk jurisdictions, and you're going to take a broader approach. You're going to look at every relationship, but only in relation to high risk jurisdictions, not just everything. That's only 16,000. So if you're going to look at second cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents, but you're going to be looking at them in relation to high risk positions and high risk jurisdictions, it's way more targeted than just saying, let's treat everyone the same. And then ultimately what you're aiming to do in sort of bringing this all together, and this is a sort of a simplified example where we're plotting this on position versus relationship risk and country territory risk. Of course, we fully expect that your own internal risk model would be more multi-dimensional. You're going to take on board more than those two risk factors, but the outcome through way of demonstration is the same. You're going to have your absolute lowest risks that effectively don't change anything. Don't need to do enhanced due diligence. It really doesn't fit into regulatory requirements for what you do or where you're doing business. So you can effectively choose to ignore them. But beyond that, you've then got identifiable but very, very low risk. Maybe you're going to submit those to quite tight screening rules. You're going to submit them to fairly standardized monitoring processes. You're not going to put any sort of product restrictions in place. You're going to do a layer up from that, maybe a sort of a medium screening regimen against those customers, submit them to regular monitoring. You're going to maybe restrict some of the very high risk products, but generally speaking, the majority of your product offerings are going to be available to them. And then going up a level again, you're then starting to get into your really high risk territory. And you're potentially going to submit a much broader screening regimen, maybe cross-referencing adverse media information as well. You're going to submit them to very close behavioral monitoring. There's going to be very restricted product offerings. There might be additional layers of authorization required internally within your business before those accounts can be opened. And ultimately, what we're looking to do here is draw tolerance lines a low tolerance line like we've got here is your acceptable level of we don't need to do anything. And then you may have, as you head further and further up on both axes there, a tolerance line at which point close monitoring, restricted products, and further authorization is still not going to be sufficient. You're simply not going to conduct business. So a simplified example, but by way of showing you here, that's the sort of mentality you need to get to. Risk rating them on those sort of multiple factors and applying different procedures for ongoing monitoring, product restrictions, and authorization on an ongoing basis.
And I think this, Kieran, brings out the point we were making earlier about a well-documented, robust rationale behind your process is going to be essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we did this webinar earlier on today on our other time zones, one of the questions we got was, does it matter that I score my PEPs as level 1, level 2, level 3, and then would it be okay to not do enhanced due diligence on 2 and 3? That's not the question. The question is, what does level 1, 2, and 3 actually mean? It doesn't matter what the label is that's attached to it. It's being able to demonstrate how you're risk assessing them and what the triggers for that are in terms of ongoing monitoring, product restrictions, and so on. It's the underlying methodology by way of calculating that risk and doing ongoing monitoring of that risk that the regulators actually care about. You can call them amber, green, and red. You can call them level 1, level 2, level 3. You can call them high, medium, low risk. It really doesn't matter as long as that underlying methodology for how you get to that label is well documented and well understood and well tested. And one of the things we'll always stress is when you're looking at this problem, always consider that you've got sort of 3 prongs to this. You've got your client data, what you've been able to collect about your customer, what you know about them in terms of KYC. Who are they? Where do they live? What other addresses do they have? How much of that information can you collect? And then think about how best you can utilize that when comparing it against the data that's out there on PEPs. Country, as I said, is a key one for PEPs, whereas for sanctions, you frequently want to be a bit looser in terms of how you use it. And that really comes down to that middle bit, the matching rules. When looking at screening for PEPs, don't make that decision in a vacuum. Look at what you've got, look at what's out there on PEP databases, make an informed decision about how best you can utilize those matching rules and the technology that stitches those two data sets together to best identify. I think we've got another question here, Steve, as well, asking on behalf of someone else as an analyst, where does one stop as far as which family member is considered as close relative? What is the risk appetite associated with that?
And I think the question here is really not to say, that if it's a in-law that you can stop before you get to the in-laws. I think you have to look at what you can determine about that relationship in the context of the business, and that's really going to get back to that facts and circumstances sort of question. So I would advise that your well-documented, well-rationalized process not necessarily put in hard stops at certain degrees of separation in terms of family relationship. I think it needs to look at what you know about the relationship that exists between the PEP and the close associate, all right, and make the determinations based upon what you can determine about the relationship, not strictly by the degrees of separation.
Yeah. And when you consider those risk factors that we were talking about, think of it like this: 2 different examples. An in-law of a UK politician who's not had a prominent position for 20 years. So you're taking on board the position when that position was, their relationship, and the territory. But equally, what if somebody is an in-law of a senior member of the armed forces in Sudan, and they are still in that position now? It's the same relationship, but it's the relationship to which PEP and where that PEP is, and is that PEP still in that prominent public function? And that's where, as Steve said, the circumstance matters, not just purely the label of an in-law. But good question, excellent question so far. And by way of showing the advantage of using those kind of risk-based levers, if you will, in creating efficiency, When we look back at an example of how we've worked with a number of our customers over the years, and one in particular here, traditional sort of one size fits all, we're just going to use same match rules and same sort of tolerances for monitoring of all sanctions, all PEPs, everything gets treated the same. Screening 1 million customers with a match rate of 15% of the total volume. So 15% of 1 million is going to create at least something for you to investigate, if not multiple somethings. So potential expected matches of 150,000, averaged at a specific number of time, I think it's 15 minutes to do an initial investigation. You're looking at 25,000 working hours. You then go up and you start saying, well, we're going to look at tighter rules against all PEPs, looser rules against sanctions, but leverage the data a bit better. That goes down by 27%. And then when you really get up to the ultimate aim here, the granular risk-based approach, excluding expired PEPs, non-relevant PEPs based on risk and based on position and role, you can get that down to 20,000 matches from 150,000, and 25,000 hours goes down to just over 3,000, 87% reduction. Now, of course, this is going, your mileage is going to vary dependent on your company, your own risk profiles, how you risk rate, the jurisdictions you're in, and the underlying regulations you're adhere to. But the example here is that ultimately the one size fits all never really fits anyone, as we always say. You're just casting a very wide net in the hope that you're going to catch everything. But in that hope, and especially in PEPs where there is such divergence of definitions and guidance, you are also going to generate completely unnecessary matches. PEPs that haven't held that position for 20 years, PEPs in countries that are very, very low risk, and it's a PEP or additional domestic screening requirement in Spain that we don't need to do, and things like that. So there is absolutely massive advantages in applying the risk-based approach to the actual screening and identification process. So at this point, we've got our summary and questions. And I think, Steve, we have got one further question on here that we haven't got to yet, which is, can you advise on the best enhanced due diligence documents to request for PEPs? There are so many various suggestions. These documents will help with the risk. So, Steve, what would you say are the key things from an EDD perspective that really need to be asked?
Well, I think it really comes down to needing to understand source of wealth and source of funds, and to establish a financial picture for the PEP, and then ask the question about whether that presents itself as reasonable based upon what you know about the PEP, both in their role and in their history. So that's what it really comes down to, I think, is getting that information about individuals that have been identified in PEPs. I think that, self-certification forms about are you a PEP or are you not a PEP, that's going to vary, and I think the reliability of those is probably going to be suspect. Not necessarily because someone might lie on that, but because, as we've seen here today, the definitions are really across the board, and there's a lot of room for interpretation. And so, do you have a form, a check the box form, and the answer comes down to no, and the customers fill that out? It may be because they simply had a different interpretation that was not in line with your risk assessment, your risk file. So I think that the identification process needs to be one that is handled from a more internal perspective, and then in terms of the documentation gathered from those individuals that you've identified as PEPs, really need to focus in on source of wealth and source of funds.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll move on to our summary, because that's all of our questions. But we have had a lot of great questions today, so we really thank everyone for their participation. Makes for a very interesting discussion. But in summary, what we're really saying here is there's a regulatory focus on PEPs and the related due diligence that is increasing. We saw that earlier on in the sort of the time scale between 2014, 2017, and then 2020 and every subsequent year since. Certain countries that are only focusing on foreign PEPs almost certainly are going to be considered outliers going forward. And robust and well-documented risk assessment processes, along with the timely and ongoing customer risk ratings, are essential. As we said, it's not the end goal and the rating you apply, it's the how you get there that needs to be well understood and well tested. There are numerous tools and external data sources that can be used to refine the PEP risk assessment process and the ongoing screening and monitoring processes. And PEP databases are broad and varied, mainly because they have to be to account for the divergence. So use tools combined with your risk-based approach to refine how you're going to use that database. And take a multifaceted approach to assessing that PEP risk and adapt your ongoing monitoring